Welcome to Rasha's World, where you will hear prominent voices, psychoanalysts, psychologists, therapists, philosophers, and thought leaders talk about a variety of mental health concerns and problems, including how to deal with anxiety, depression, and chronic conditions, and how to become more resilient, find inner peace, be emotionally engaged in your personal and professional life, and just be your beautiful, authentic self. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Rasha's World. Today we have a special guest who has returned to Rasha's World, Rabbi Matthew Ponak. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing, Rash?
Very good. It's so glad to have you back. And last time we talked about Embodied Kabbalah, your book, which is Jewish mysticism for all people. And that went really well. And now we have another book that we're going to talk about. So what's the book?
So the book is called The Path of the Sephirot, and it is also for all people, though that's not in the title. It's meant to be an access point to the study of divine emanations from Kabbalah. Mm-hmm. And so these are layers of reality, or what you could call divine qualities. And this book is specifically focused on a 49-day period during the Jewish calendar between the holidays of Passover and Shavuot. That period's called the Omer, and it's 49 permutations of these divine emanations, which allow for unique reflections and contemplations day by day. And the purpose is self-growth, healing, and to use kind of Kabbalistic metaphors, clearing the way for the divine light to come through.
Yeah, and I love it. I mean, there's so much that we can benefit from and learn from and practice and so on. But before I dive into that, what would you say is the Kabbalah for again our audience who doesn't know? And what I also like is that you're looking at it not as something that's out there, but as a living tradition, something that we can incorporate into our daily lives, a daily practice, and so on, which I love, So it's not just some esoteric idea out there. It has applications in our everyday life. But how would you briefly describe that to our audience here?
Yeah. And I really like that you're highlighting that the fact that it's a living tradition. I say that in the preface of the book, and it's very important because sometimes we humans have a desire or an innate tendency to idolize the past and freeze it there, as opposed to understanding that everything evolves and everything changes and grows. Mm-hmm. So Kabbalah is a term that refers often to the whole entirety of Jewish mysticism. Mm-hmm. But it was also a particular movement that arose, or that was written down first in the Middle Ages. And it's really a system of understanding the journey between the finite and the infinite. And what Kabbalah in essence says is there are many layers and gradations and many different elements of that journey. And so Kabbalah has been popular within the Jewish world since it sort of came onto the scene and evolved and changed in various ways throughout the ages. But it also, starting in the 1400s, Kabbalah has been popular in the Christian world and has had influences and branches and roots that it's grown elsewhere. And so today there's actually many forms of Kabbalah that exist, all going back to the first times it was written down in, let's say, around the 13th century or 12th century in Western Europe. But that's what it's really about. It's these divine emanations, these Sephirot, and how they can impact our lives and represent different stages of our journeys and different divine qualities we can encounter and refine in ourselves.
What I really like in your book that you're saying about aligning our inner selves with divine purpose. I mean, that is just so beautiful. And so the Sephirot is a way of trying to attempt that. I mean, there are the 7 sacred attributes that you're talking about. And let's dive into that. What are the ways of kind of fine-tuning our minds, our souls with something that is, again, the finite with the infinite. I love that interplay.
Exactly. So in the sense of a sacred attribute, so if I say the word love or loving kindness, something is going to come to mind for each of us in our own way, but we all have a general sense of what it means to be kind, whether we actualize that every day or not. So partly in the most practical, most everyday sense, there's a whole week. In fact, we're meeting right now in the week of loving kindness and this counting. The first week is dedicated to that. And conventional loving kindness or love is about being good to people. It's about saying yes to our inherent goodness. It's about noticing that our charity and our generosity can have ripple effects beyond ourselves. There's all these different elements of what it means. But there's also a sense that you'll find in the tradition of a love that is beyond conventional love. Like the Sephirot of Chesed, the divine quality of love, is not just that kind of conventional goodness. It is, think about a love that is so great that it can be given to anyone regardless of their actions. Right? There's a teaching I'm just learning and teaching about this week from a Hasidic master called the Aptarav, and he says there's two ways that God conducts the world. One of them is if you're good, you get blessings. If you're bad, you get punishments, right? That sort of conventional, like karmic view of like we know it doesn't always work like that, but he says that's one way God works. And he says the other way God works, and that's associated with this holiday of Passover we're in right now, with this greater love, where that people receive love regardless of who they are or what they quote unquote deserve. Can we tap into that, to this great love, this higher love that can we embody that, right? That's part of the quest of this kind of not just conventional chesed, conventional loving kindness, but the sacred attribute of love goes beyond ordinary love, right? Yeah. And this is about tapping into that.
And I love that.
Emissaries or channels of it. Yeah.
The micro with the macro, because I mean, I see that with myself. I've become much more positive in my outlook, and much more patient, calmer, more loving, and that's just me. But then there are these repercussions around me, and I see the effects on the immediate family, on my friends, and so on. So when you're doing that to yourself, when you are changing towards love and all the kindness, as you're saying, it has that ripple effect throughout the world. So basically, you're changing the whole world that way.
Absolutely. That's so part of the goal of this practice. And this is not just in my approach to it in this book, but in the traditional sense, is healing the world. And where do we start? For most of us, we start with ourselves.
Exactly.
Right? Because none of us as embodied beings, as physical beings in this dimension, are perfect. So there's always opportunity to heal that brokenness, to look at what isn't right. And so, yeah, day by day.
That's tikkun.
That's tikkun, yes. This word, exactly. Tikkun, right. Yeah. It is about, that means healing or repair. And we can heal the world by healing ourselves. It's all interconnected.
Yes, absolutely. So let's dive into them. I mean, there are seven weeks, and 7 times 749. I love the math involved with it.
There's
too,
great
right?
math here. There's a lot of math in Kabbalah.
Yeah.
Right.
And 7 is my second favorite number. So that's perfect.
What's your favorite number, if 11. I might ask? 11. Okay.
11. I was born in 11. So.
Wow. Very nice. Yeah. Very cool. So 7. There are 7 days in the week.
That's right.
It's this kind of number that signifies wholeness. So the legend goes that on the first night of Passover, which was the Exodus, when the Israelites were first taken out of Egypt, they were brought up to this really high spiritual level associated with the number 50. That's sort of beyond the 7. It's this beyond space, beyond time kind of realm where it's all good and it's all one, that kind of spiritual level. But then the next day they were sort of more themselves again, like the day after kind of thing. And so these 49 days are then 49 journeys to reclaiming that wholeness through work, not just through the blessing of because we exist, we get to be blessed with this high level of 50, but now we get to work day by day towards that goal. That's one way of understanding.
I love how 50 is the integration of integration. I love that.
Yes.
You're integrating integration.
Absolutely right. Yes. Yeah. So the 7 I'll give the bird's eye view and we can go wherever you like from here. But so 7 weeks means that each week is associated with one of these 7 divine qualities. And because there's 7 days in a week, each day of every week has also one of these 7 within them. So the first week is the week of loving kindness, and day 1 of every week is the loving kindness day. So day 1 will be loving kindness of loving kindness. That's the love that emerges from love.
Right.
And so the second week is associated with boundaries. That is, if week 1 is saying yes, expansiveness, week 2 and day 2 of every week is saying no. But not with anger or wrath, saying no with equanimity. Can we have the sacred no? That's the cultivation of week 2.
Yeah.
Week 3 is about harmony. It's about a sense of peacefulness and calmness. And it's also about the balance between yes and no. Because in this system, to be compassionate isn't just giving things to people who are in need. It's also setting boundaries with people that ought to have boundaries, right?
Mhm.
That compassion is a combination of the yes and no energy. And also that week is associated with just the sense of well-being and calm and good state from which all of the other qualities can arise.
Mhm.
Week 4 and day 4 of every week is about holy action. That is a type of striving that isn't conditioned upon what we're encountering, which might be obstacles. It's can we have a sense of real mission and purpose and going forward energy? Week 5 and now day 5 every week is associated with yielding. Again, it's that counterbalance to the action. Can we be abiding? Can we accept? Can we have gratitude for what is right now and patience? It's holy waiting, if you will.
Mhm.
Then we have week 6 and day 6 of every week is about connection. It's we might have access to all these wonderful qualities, but can we teach that to others? Can we be in harmony with people? Is there a connection point, like a synaptic node between two neurons? That one neuron might have all of the great insight and energy, but if it can't connect, where are we? And finally, the last day of every week and the final week is all about integration. So, for example, it's called receiving in this system. It's the Hebrew word is shekhinah. It means something like presence. And there's so many great associations with all of these. I had to boil them down for the sake of a fairly accessible day-by-day book. But receiving at the end of each week, it's about, do I deserve love? Like, is there something blocking love from just being part of who I am? Do I deserve to have boundaries, right? And then the last week is all about integrating, looking back on all of these weeks, all of these cultivations of love, boundaries, harmony, action, yielding, connection, and saying, what really can live within me that I can keep going forward with to integrate that particular quality. And as you said, the very last day is the integration of integration,
Mhm.
right? What's next on the journey?
And it's really well written, and it's like it's a self-help book, but with a mystical bent there, and
Yeah,
which I find
thanks. Yeah,
really
that's a good
cool.
way of summing up the genre, I think, on this one in particular. The last book was more scholarly and academic. It was things that I really and still deeply believe in, but it was more thoughts, more
Yeah,
words, more
exactly.
content. And this one is digestible. It could be put out eventually as like a flip calendar almost,
Exactly.
day by
Yeah.
day, like piece by piece. And some people are using it for the cycle of the 49 days, and others are just counting it day by day. Really, like there's no rules here. I think people should engage with it in however is going to be helpful for
And
them.
you have questions in daily contemplation, and I want to quote some of them that I
Please,
found
yeah, I'm
very,
honored.
very cool.
Yes, go ahead.
So, be compassionate to yourself by being disciplined. Both self-limitation and self-love are needed for inner well-being. And I love that. And I want to talk about the sacred no here because that fits
Yeah.
in really nicely. So, how would you paraphrase that again in your own words?
Sure. And to be clear, I didn't coin the term sacred no. There's actually a book by that title. I haven't read it, but I love the title and I love I can't remember the author at this moment, but the notion of we all know what it's like to be yelled at, unfortunately, or most of us do probably,
Mhm.
right? Unless we're living on some paradisical island somewhere.
Mhm.
And we know what it's like to be angry at others and to yell at them or worse, right? So because of that, so you and I are both Canadian, right? We know what it's like to exist in a society that isn't the most comfortable with anger or boundaries
Mhm.
relative to other places in the world
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah.
So coming from a perspective, let's say as a Canadian or many Americans as well, that it's possible to set boundaries and have that expression kind of burn clean, guilt-free, shame-free. There's nothing wrong with setting a boundary. In fact, in the right instance, it's so right.
Because you're valuing yourself, you're giving yourself
Yes,
value. Yeah.
exactly. And so that's more, I'm speaking of it as in a relational sense. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like one of the ways people talk about it in the sort of more modern tradition is if you raise a child and all they hear is yes, that's
Mhm.
called spoiling them.
Yeah.
And if all they hear is no, that's almost abusive, right? But a balance of the yes and the no in the right time, like that's true kindness. So you actually can't have true kindness or true compassion in that sense without no. So how do you say a no without it being an angry or a wrathful no? That's the cultivation here.
Yeah.
And it's also true with ourselves. So that loving energy I spoke of initially, with ourselves, that's called delight. That's treating yourself, right? Giving yourself an early Christmas present, or however you want to put it, or like having that dessert. And on the other hand, the sacred no, or the gevura in Hebrew, that energy of restraint or even discipline, is about saying no to yourself. Because if all you ever say is yes to yourself, well, guess what? You're spoiling yourself.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's actually not healthy either. We have to have restraint. So that sacred no inside of us is about self-limitation, but for a higher purpose.
Yeah.
It's about being our best selves and being healthy and all of that. So the balance of the love energy and the boundaries energy, the yes and the no, allows us to enter into a state of harmony in ourselves and in our relationships to the outside world.
Yeah, and I love the balance that you mentioned, and that's the next one, right? So finding that balance between yes and no, and kind of like the yin and yang of Tao. It's like you need to have that balance. If it's all no or all yes, then you're not in alignment, you know?
Yeah, and it's a punctuated equilibrium, or maybe that's the wrong term. I love evolutionary theory. That's but a bit of a tangent. It's a shifting equilibrium. There are times in our lives that are yes times, like a holiday. If we're on vacation or just a celebratory time in our lives, we're at a birthday party, that's a yes moment. But if we're trying to study for that exam or have a big project with our work, that's kind of the no energy time. We're saying no to invitations perhaps in those moments. And so there's times for either. But the wholeness of it really is when we can have, it's like we've attained something. If people like the Marvel movies, it's a little bit like the Rings of Power. Is that what they're called? No, now I'm into the Tolkien universe. But the rings that the bad guy is acquiring, that it gives him each different abilities over time. Thanos, or the different. Each Sephirot is kind of like that. They have particular qualities and they can be attained. Now, fortunately, they're not only for one person where we can all tap into them. But it's like some people have more love than they have boundaries. And so a lot of the work for them will be in that second week. And that can be a lifestyle. Can we take maybe a year and really work on that boundaries energy? But once we have more access to them, it doesn't feel as forced. It feels innate because we have these sacred qualities within us. It's sometimes about clearing the way so they can emerge kind of naturally and organically in how we relate to ourselves and each other.
Yeah, and just to give an example, like people pleasing, that's good, but not on a constant basis, right?
Yes.
You have to find that balance there.
Yes, but sometimes people pleasing is very helpful.
That's right.
Actually, we shouldn't deny that. That's like day 2 in this whole 49-day cycle. It's the boundaries that emerge from love. So it turns out if you're nice to someone, overly nice, and they're actually kind of a scary, dangerous person, and you need to almost please them in that moment so you can then get away. That's actually a good tool to have in our tool belt. But if that's the only way we can deal with people, let's say it's a bully in your own home, like that's not going to work in the long term. So, it's about all these different tools.
Now, also, sending away critics makes room for your inner voice to emerge. And are you talking about critics, outside critics, or the inner critic, or both here?
Well, it turns out that those two things are related.
Yes.
But it's funny, I haven't memorized my book, so I'm not sure exactly which page you're looking at, but the way that appears or sounds to me when you read it out, you can tell me which page is it on. I could look it up too, but I'm thinking about inner critics there. Yeah. Often. And so, but our inner critic, those parts of us that are really judging us, are often very informed by our external reality as we grow up, especially and possibly even intergenerationally, something subtle that can come through that our parents or grandparents aren't aware of. The notion is, though, that there's a lot of energy from that critical voice. And if we can work with it by not just learning from it, but actually sending it away, not in an overly wrathful way, but we can actually set boundaries with the inner critic voice. And once we can tame it more, if you will, there's some of that energy we reclaim, but it also gives access to less distraction. If the ruminations calm down, we can hear our authentic self in a more clear way. But it is the same if you're at a dialogue, let's say, and someone's really harsh there and they don't want a dialogue, they want to yell or they want to control. Creating limitations in the external sense can allow space for more meaningful, fruitful conversation.
And compassion is the key word here too, because both from the critic as well as towards the inner critic, of finding that compassion of like really understanding, like, this sounds harsh, but there is some good ideas there, some good intention.
So yeah, when it comes to inner critic work in particular, there's different approaches different people have. I like to combine them, but one is more about listening and saying, well, what does the inner critic really want from us? It sounds
Exactly.
harsh, but
That's
what
what
is
I
it
do.
actually saying? What's it afraid of?
Yeah.
And the other one is saying, nobody talks to me like that. You may not talk to me like that. And actually, in a sense, training it. And
Yeah.
I encourage people, perhaps with a guide or something like that, to try out these forms, because different moments actually call for different approaches.
I have one more. Love
Mm.
flows from a peaceful heart.
Mm-hmm.
I really like that.
Yeah. And that would be, I think I've memorized that one. That is the chesed of Tiferet. That is the loving kindness of harmony. Is that correct?
I believe so.
You
I
wrote it
did not
down.
note it down, so
That's okay. In any case, so we can think about cultivating love, like taking extra efforts to bring kindness into our worlds or to ourselves. But there's also this reality that when we're doing well, when we're calm, when, let's say, we're well fed, well rested, when we're around people we love, all of that, when we're at ease, there's a sense of lovingness that can just naturally emerge.
Mhm,
So part of the, if you will, strategy to get at having more love in our lives is coming to a place where we can be well.
mhm, mhm. And what I've noted here too is the inner alignment with that. That's important. A state of calm. I think that's very important too, and being collected so that you're actually really responding with your heart and your inner voice, like your true authentic self. And often we don't pause to get to that point. We sometimes react immediately, or we're on the defensive and so on. So I like that kind of that place that comes really like from a grounded way, that from
Yeah.
your inner self. Yeah.
And I think in that description you're giving, so many of those qualities can come in. We can have that sense of yielding, that
Mhm.
sense of waiting, right? The sense of connecting to groundedness. That's got a little bit of also that receiving
Mhm.
energy in it, and that last day and that last week. But you're right. It's easy, especially if we're living very cognitive, sort of heady kind of existences, which are sort of the default here in our society right now,
Mhm.
to react from a place of urgency or stress, or just trying to be rational about it. And sometimes rationality is great. And at other times, the reaction, the movement can bubble up from a deeper place in ourselves if we give it a little bit of patience and calm
Mhm.
from the get-go.
I'd be also interested to talk a little bit about the tree of life. What would you
Mm-hmm.
say? Because that's a bit of a mystery to me, but
Mm-hmm.
it's also a fascination. So, how does that fit in also with our discussion here, the tree of life?
So the tree of life, as you may know, is a very ancient biblical metaphor.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually not a metaphor, really. If you look at it, it's a story about Adam and Eve living in the Garden of Eden, and there's a tree of knowledge of good and evil, which they're not supposed to touch, and the tree of life, which is just there, but they don't really get into that much detail around.
Yeah, yeah, it's somewhere in the corner, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and God kicks them out of the garden after they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil for fear that they will eat from the tree of life and live forever.
There
And
you
I
go.
believe if you were to look at it historically, there's some connection between ancient Canaanite theologies in that region and sort of what eventually gets written down in the Bible. But regardless of sort of what is preceding that myth that's written down, the tree of life becomes a very important metaphor in Jewish mysticism.
Mhm.
And in Kabbalah, one of the things that the tree of life stands for is the whole map of the Sephirot. So if people see the cover of my book, The Path of the Sephirot, there's 10 spheres that are linked with lines. That whole structure is called the tree of life. The tree of life also sometimes refers to the divine quality of harmony, or Tiferet in Hebrew. But usually when people say the tree of life, they refer to these 10 divine qualities that can also be seen as layers of reality or dimensions between the finite and the infinite. And
Mhm.
in that sense, it's a pathway that we can walk, and we can taste of the fruits of the tree of life. That might be like, what does divine love taste like? What does divine boundaries taste like? And all of that. But we can almost, you could say, walk. People don't usually use this metaphor, but really you can climb the tree of life. And it's a pathway between the finite and the infinite, and the various gradations and unfoldings of our spiritual lives.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of mysticism because I like those kind of ideas, and so it's the divine essence that becomes revealed to us. But
Hmm.
I like how you also say the divine interacts with the universe, and
Hmm.
so that kind of connection too. It's not like just like passive out there, and you're trying to connect, but there is that flow between a divine energy
Exactly.
and human energy, and trying to figure things out for us. You know?
And one of the ways of understanding that experientially is sometimes the divine energy, it's there, but it's blocked.
Yeah.
And it might be because of our psyche is blocking.
Mhm.
Like the ego is wonderful for functionality in this plane of existence,
Mhm.
but it is also something that obscures the deeper layers of who
Yeah.
we are. And so it's called Shefa in Kabbalah. It's like
Mhm.
abundance, divine blessing, and it wants to flow. It's like the sap that can eventually, you can think of the tree of life also as an upside down tree. And we can taste the fruits that come, and that sap is emerging from the roots that are in heaven, so to speak, or in the deeper layers of
Oh,
reality.
yeah.
But sometimes because of the knots of our soul, so to speak, there's things that get twisted or cut off, that introspection, deep introspection that frees up energy, maybe working through traumas or some kind of blockage, we can
Yeah.
get to a place where we can actually taste some of those fruits. And that's when we get contact with the Sephirot, with the divine energy, the divine manifestation that comes in different forms.
Yeah, and in a way, it reminds me of psychoanalysis, but again with a mystical bent of that, and which is again what you're doing because you're unblocking, you're trying to like open up the knots that are like blocking you to
Yes.
your connection, right?
Yeah, so some of these metaphors are very ancient, and some of the teachings that I bring in the book are very modern.
Mhm.
They're informed both by modern psychology and in later forms of Jewish mysticism. It's a living tradition, and that's it. It's a living tree, if you will. It continues to unfold and bear new fruit in every age.
Mhm.
So Freud, as you probably know, was Jewish. He had
Yeah.
a traditional Jewish upbringing. I'm not personally sure of how much connection with Kabbalah he had, but it was in the scene that he was getting enculturated into as a child because it's
And
everywhere.
unconsciously, he was influenced
Unconsciously,
by it.
yeah.
There you go.
And
Yeah.
Carl Jung apparently, near the end of his life, discovered Jewish mysticism and had a great respect for it because a lot of the things that are articulated in this tradition have a great deal of resonance with Jungian psychology. The word sephirah, which I translate as divine quality often or sacred attribute, could also be translated as archetype. It's a fundamental part
My
of
goodness.
who we
Okay.
are, and that can be found in all of our myths. And it's
Yeah.
this kind of pure energy form that they have differentiations between them, but what they share in common is this deep, profound wisdom and role that they play in all of our lives.
Yeah, wonderful. So the book is The Path of the Sephirot, a 49-day Omer Counter for spiritual growth and inner balance. So you are mentioning those things in your book title. And it's like each day is an opportunity there for reflection, each of these
Mhm.
49 days, for refining, for connecting with the divine, and for manifesting here also the divine qualities.
Absolutely, to bring them into our lives because it is a wonderful thing. It's a blessing to encounter something like this in meditation or through some kind of introspection, but it's another thing also to live it out. And those that might flow naturally, but often it's possible to get distracted and not actually have the full manifestation. So really they're all connected.
Yeah.
Deep introspection and feeling into who we really are and going on that kind of inner search, but also then finding ways to have a vessel or a container for that through action, whether that's a creative project or a holy deed, or simply cultivating daily reminders to allow us to be embodiments more and more of these sacred qualities.
What a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Rabbi Matthew Ponak. You are a teacher of Jewish mysticism, a spiritual counselor, and an author. And thank you so much for being on Arash's World here.
Really appreciate that, Arash. And if people want to get in touch with me, they can join me at MatthewPonak.com. That's MatthewPonak.com to contact me and find out more about these offerings. And many blessings to you, to all who are listening. May you find and embody the divine qualities.